Welcome to this presentation on research ethics. As a researcher, as a scholar, as somebody who's engaging in active inquiry, you need to be responsible. You need to engage in responsible inquiry. And there are lots of aspects of research that have degrees of oversight, such as the use of animals in research, about the use of biohazardous substances, and of course there's also the issue of human subjects. And in medical education, in health professions education, human ethics review is by far the most common component. So this presentation is going to look about what it is and how it works. Well, there are some key principles to consider when engaging in research or inquiry involving human subjects. There should be a respect for persons. You should respect the autonomy of the individuals involved, and for instance, they need to be able to give free, informed and ongoing consent. And you need to be protecting those who with a developing impaired or diminished autonomy in terms of the harms they may come to. And for instance, students, given that they do face a degree of risk when their faculty, their preceptors, their teachers are researching them, then there should be a consent for the respect for the person of the student, but also really for anybody else who's involved in the research. You should be concerned for the welfare of the individuals involved, for instance, considering the impact on their individual physical, mental and spiritual health, as well as their physical, economic and social circumstances. And you should always embrace the principles of justice in terms of being fair, treating all people with equal respect and concern, and equity in terms of distributing benefits and burdens of research participation. In Canada, this is governed by the Tri-Council Policy Statement, or TCPS, on the ethical conduct for research involving humans. And at the time of making this presentation, the 2014 version is the current version, and there's the URL on the slide. There is a policy statement, a PDF of the policy, and a tutorial on that website. And you need to complete the tutorial, including the tests at the end, to be able to get your TCPS2 certificate. This is the certificate that you'll need to submit as a researcher with pretty much any research application to a research ethics board that involves human subjects. What does TCPS2 cover? Well, it covers things like the consent process. It considers issues of fairness and equity, privacy and confidentiality. It considers conflicts of interest, particularly in regards to the researchers. It gives guidance to multi-jurisdictional research, so for instance, research conducted across multiple institutions or even across multiple countries. It also particularly has a focus on research involving indigenous peoples, and it has particular guidance regarding qualitative research for which the principles may need to be slightly different relative to quantitative research. In terms of the consent process, TCPS sets out when and how to do a consent, that it needs to be informed, that talks about what the research involves and what risks are associated with our participation in that research. And you need to be clear that each and every individual is free to decline to participate or to withdraw at any time without any kind of penalty. The consent process is also sets out when not to do it. And that's when, for instance, it may not be practical to do a consent, at least in advance of a study. So, for instance, if the subjects need to be unaware that they are being observed, or that the scale of study or access to subjects means that consent is not practical. Now, the general principle is that you should always get consent whenever you can, so the exceptions have to be defended in the sense that they are truly necessary and not just arbitrary decisions not to engage in a consent process. TCPS also is concerned with issues of fairness and equity, for instance, such as appropriate inclusion and appropriate exclusion from research. So, for instance, individuals should not be excluded from a study on the basis of their culture, language, religion, race, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, linguistic proficiency, gender or age, unless there is a valid scientific reason for that exclusion. And again, that would need to be defended and judged at the REB level. TCPS also talks about issues around privacy and confidentiality. For instance, they define what privacy is and confidentiality is. They talk about the security of the data that you collect, how you work with identifiable information, and in principle, the less information, the absolute minimum amount of identifiable information you collect to be able to conduct your research. So don't collect anything that's identifiable that you don't strictly need to capture for your research purposes. And they also talk about the secondary use of identifiable information for research purposes, and really the secondary use of any information that's about human subjects. So for instance, if you want to go and look at an existing data set, either from a previous research study that somebody else conducted, or data, for instance, in the student learner record, or in an electronic health record, and so on, that's considered secondary use of data. The data already exists, but you have to go through a consent and an authorization process to be able to access it. The people who police this are at the institutional level, and they are generally called the Research Ethics Board, although they have different names, such as Independent Ethics Committees, and in the United States they tend to be called IRBs. But IRBs, REBs, and the others, they're all essentially the same. They're the group who are responsible for maintaining research ethics standards at an institutional level, primarily through the review of research proposals and then monitoring how those research initiatives that have been approved are conducted. Now, the University of Calgary has two REBs, the Conjoint Health Research Ethics Board, or CREB, which is for kinesiology, medicine and nursing, and then the Conjoint Faculties Research Ethics Board, CFREB, for everybody else. So by and large, if you're doing health professions education research, which is most likely going to fall into kinesiology, medicine or nursing, then you'll go through CREB. But if you're in a different faculty, for instance, if you might be in social work, then you go through the CFREB. A common question is whether a study needs REB review. And as a rule of thumb, if it's about engaging in research, then the answer is almost certainly yes. But the answer is maybe for program evaluation and audit, which is purely for internal quality assurance processes. At the University of Calgary, we have access to a tool called ARECI, which offers training tools and support to help project leads and organizations in assessing and answering the kinds of questions such as, does my study need REB review? And the URL is there. But by and large, assume that it does, and as a principle, conduct any form of inquiry to the highest possible ethical standards, so that even if your quality assurance study does not need ethics review, do bear in mind the principles of ethical inquiry and embody them and embrace them within the work that you do. Now, when you do put in your REB submission at the University of Calgary, you do it through a thing called IRIS, an online system called the Institutional Research Information Services Solution, and that's the URL on the slide. You need to be registered in the system to be able to submit a proposal. It includes a series of templates and guides, not just for the proposal itself, but also, for instance, for a consent form and so on. And to put an application, put a proposal in, you need to fill in a series of forms that set out the study staff, a summary of what's going on, an assessment of the risks and benefits involved, what you propose about the participants, the research methods, what you're going to do about privacy and confidentiality issues, and the supporting documentation that you need to provide. First, what happens is that they'll then, once you submit, it'll go through an administrative review, which means to make sure that the application is complete, that all the information that you need to provide has been provided, all the documentation has been provided, and so on. And they may come back to you saying you haven't provided this or you haven't filled this in appropriately, and you need to go back into IRIS and then complete that before your proposal can move on to ethics review. And the ethics review is either by an expedited process by a few committee members, or it might be full review by the full committee, the REB committee. The result of that is either going to be full approval or an amended, which is the most common outcome, which is to say, we will approve this once you have fixed these issues. And sometimes you have to go through several iterations to be able to address the concerns of the REB. And you do need to make those suggested changes. If you feel that a change is quite inappropriate, then or impractical and will undermine the study, then you need to provide a robust description and case for why that you are not going to meet that. And that still has to satisfy the REB before you can proceed. Sometimes studies will be rejected, and it's rare, but it is possible. And the approval also goes through the IRIS system at the University of Calgary. Once you have research ethics approval, your responsibilities are that you need to follow the approved study design. And you need to, as the PI, principal investigator, ensure that everybody working on the project are going to be aware of the ethics and of the research ethics in general. And for instance, if they're a named individual, they generally have completed the TCPS2 tutorial and submit their certificate as well. You need to complete within the allotted time, and if you don't, or you need to make any changes to the study, then you need to submit those changes for approval back through IRIS. You need to report any significant problems or issues with conducting the study, and you need to provide a final report on the execution of the study to the REB. And you should always model robust ethical principles throughout the acts of inquiry you engage in. So in summary, to be a researcher, to be a scholar, to engage in inquiry is to engage in responsible inquiry. And there are a number of principles of research involving human subjects that you should be aware of and you should be responsible to. In Canada, we do that, and it's generally governed through the use of the Tri-Council Policy Statement on Research Ethics with Human Individuals, that talks about the consent process, about fairness and equity in research participation, and about issues of privacy and confidentiality. In doing so at the University of Calgary, as with any institution you work through a research ethics board, we have two, CREB and the CFREB. There is an ethics review process that goes through an online system called IRIS, and you have a series of responsibilities both in terms of making your proposal and getting your proposal approved, and then conducting your study so that it follows the commitment you've made out in your proposal. And throughout, you should always model high standards of ethical behaviour in the conducting of research.